Good time of the day, everyone. My name is Bianca Brasil. I am the Program Manager for Business Engagement at the Secretariat of the Convention on Biological Diversity, and I have the pleasure to welcome you all to Session 4 of the Business and Biodiversity Week 2021. The session today will focus on energy sector. Energy production, as you know, relies heavily on biodiversity and ecosystem services. From oil and gas extraction to hydro, wind, and solar power, biodiversity loss poses a critical risk to the sector as a whole. Energy production and use is the single biggest contributor to global warming, accounting for roughly 2/3 of human-induced greenhouse gas emissions. Global demand for energy is increasing rapidly due to population and economic growth, especially in emerging market economies. While accompanied by great prosperity, rising demand creates new challenges. Energy security concerns can emerge as more consumers require ever more energy resources. A sustainable energy future will require new thinking and new systems, essentially a transformation in the way we produce, deliver, and consume energy. The energy sector has made progress in identifying effective ways of managing biodiversity alongside their decarbonization targets. This session will highlight some concrete examples from the energy sector where businesses have implemented innovative approaches to address both the climate and biodiversity loss as part of the same complex problem. I would like to introduce our moderator for today, Sharon Brooks. She is the Deputy Head of Business and Biodiversity Program at UNEP WCMC, the World Conservation Monitoring Center. So Sharon, thank you for joining us, and the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Bianca. Thank you for the introduction, and thank you for having me here today to moderate this session. So as Bianca said, my name is Sharon Brooks. I'm the Deputy Head of the Business and Biodiversity Program at the UN Environment Program World Conservation Monitoring Center, where we've been working closely with energy companies for many years, actually supporting them on biodiversity management. So before we begin, just to remind everyone that the session is being recorded. The video will be made available in a few days on the Business Biodiversity's webpage, and a message including the link will be sent out to registered participants. If you have any questions to any of the speakers, please do use the Q&A box, and we will do our best to direct those to the panelists later on in the session. So just to set the scene for today, so following on from the remarks that Bianca provided around the energy sector, the energy sector is, of course, hugely diverse in terms of the activities it involves, and one that is rapidly shifting in response to the climate challenge that we have ahead of us, with anticipated growth in renewable sectors and a high degree of innovation at play to meet growing demands of our societies. So while the climate challenges and the needs for innovation within the sector to shift us away from fossil fuels is widely known, the biodiversity considerations are often less talked about. At the CBD COP13, there was a decision on mainstreaming biodiversity into the energy and mining sector, and this really highlighted, I think, the recognition of the significant impacts that these sectors can have. And this actually led to quite a bit of industry engagement at the subsequent COP14. And this was quite important for helping to contribute to building this awareness of not only the nature of the impacts of these sectors on biodiversity, but also the existing biodiversity management strategies and standards available and being developed. What is clear is that there is a lot of existing expertise and knowledge of how to understand and manage biodiversity impacts of these sectors at all stages of project life cycle, whether that's exploration of oil and gas to decommissioning energy projects. And this sector has in fact played quite a prominent role in the development of many standards related to the mitigation hierarchy, for example, commitments around no net loss and net gain that are gaining much wider traction. So the nature and scale of biodiversity impacts and dependencies is highly variable across the non-renewable and renewable energy sectors, but relates very often to the location of energy reserves relative to biodiversity. So, for example, a lot of attention is paid to the fact that a number of activities that take place either near or within areas of biodiversity importance. So in particular, the movement of oil and gas exploration into more remote and sensitive areas. It's been estimated that between $3 and $5 trillion of unexploited hydrocarbon reserves, for example, overlap with protected areas globally, so furthering the cause for them to remain in the ground. Growth in in renewables is, of course, what the world is calling for and needs. But there is a need for a responsible transition and to ensure that the very best of biodiversity management is applied to these sectors as they develop and as they scale. The impacts vary massively depending on the source, from wind farms, solar power, hydro dams, bioenergy. And it isn't just about managing sites, of course, and the direct impacts that might be associated with these sites in terms of collision risk and land clearance, fragmentation, hydrological change, and so on. But it's also about the sheer scale of demand for materials that this transition requires as these sectors are scaled up. There's a potential mismatch between the climate ambition and the availability of critical materials that's been highlighted. And there's incredible figures out there for mineral requirements of some of these new technologies, minerals such as iron, zinc, lithium, and cobalt. For example, an onshore wind plant requires 9 times more mineral resources than a gas-fired plant. An electric car requires 6 times the mineral inputs compared to a conventional car. So we need to be concerned not just about the availability to enable that transition that we very much need, but how those upstream impacts associated with producing these minerals are managed. So supply chain risk management is therefore a huge priority to enable this transition, alongside managing those site-based impacts. So therefore, it's certainly a challenge to create the speedy yet responsible transition that we need. So it's therefore wonderful that we have a fantastic lineup today of speakers who are going to talk to us about the energy sectors and how the energy sectors are responding to these dual challenges ahead, and where some of those best practices lie that we need to scale. So I would therefore like to invite the following panelists to join me here on the screen. We have, first of all, we have Emilio Tejedor from the Environment, Innovation, Sustainability and Quality at Iberdrola. We have Stephen Dickinson, from his Vice Chair of the Biodiversity Group for IPICA. And we have Ivan Vera, the Senior Expert Advisor for the Sustainable Water and Energy Solutions at the UN Department of Economic and Social Affairs. So thank you all for joining us today. It's a real pleasure to have you here. So I'm going to begin by asking each of you, I've talked a bit about the interconnected crises that we're experiencing at the moment regarding climate and nature. The energy sector, I suppose, much more emphasis has always historically been placed on climate than on biodiversity. So what changes do you see the sector needs to make in their response to one or to the other, or both in fact, to address those interconnections between climate and nature? If I could start, Emilio, to share your thoughts. Thank you.
Good morning, Sharon. Good morning, everyone attending to this presentation. And first of all, thank you for inviting me to participate in this, which is a really interesting topic. Taking it from your question, what we need to do. I mean, it is true that climate change has been kind of taking up a lot of attention, maybe as much attention as possible. And companies like us, we are, for those who do not know us, Iberdrola, we are a utility company, energy company. We generate, distribute, and commercialize electricity and gas to customers, and also energy products. We've been strongly committed with sustainability for a long time now. I mean, we started our bet on renewable generation in early 2000 because we felt like there had to be a new paradigm, a change in the way we were generating and using energy in the world, and that led us to be the leaders or one of the first companies in the world in terms of renewable energy generation and installed capacity. But sustainability has always been, or very commonly been, linked to climate change with what regards to the environment. We also need to take into consideration the social and economical considerations of sustainability. But in terms of environmental, it's been climate change, and I agree with that. But we always or we very early started to consider biodiversity as a very relevant matter that should be taken into consideration. We've been working on a number of projects developing improvements in the way we operate, and also quite thorough reports on the things we were doing and how we were impacting. But what we need to do, what we need to change, is to consider biodiversity at the same level as climate change. And I would dare to say, if at all possible, a little bit higher than climate change. The latest reports from IPs were really concerning in terms of the number of species that are under threat in this world if we continue working as we are. So we need to consider biodiversity as a really urgent matter for us as companies, that what we do in particular in our sector, we have quite a demanding use of ground, maybe not as big as other sectors, but I mean, we do have strong impacts on land use and impacts on species with our activities and things, and also impact on climate change, which is an indirect driver. But I mean, we need to consider biodiversity as a key element in considering how we impact nature, not only climate change. The agendas for climate change mitigation and adaptations are quite well developed. Anyone who wants to develop one can do it, but we need to deliver similar agendas regarding biodiversity. We need to tackle biodiversity impacts, negative impacts, as soon as possible, and balance them and reduce our impacts and compensate them as soon as possible. So I think that's the way to go. I mean, we need to consider biodiversity similarly, if not in a higher degree, as climate change.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Emilia. It's wonderful to hear. I think music to my ears to see a sort of holistic approach to trying to understand, to bring biodiversity up the radar and be able to tackle these things collectively rather than a single issue. If I could turn, Stephen, to you now, in terms of your role here representing IPICA, if you could share your thoughts on this challenge around the climate and biodiversity nexus. Thank you. We can't hear you at the moment.
For some reason, I'm.
So maybe, Stephen, we can come back to you while we sort your sound out. Let's move on to Ivan for the moment and see if we can figure out how to get your sound back. Ivan, can I bring you into discussion at this point, please, to share your thoughts on the biodiversity and climate nexus? Thank you.
Sure, Sharon. Well, first of all, thank you very much for the invitation to participate in this event. Okay. As you know, well, in the introduction, I'm working for the United Nations Department of Economic and Social Affairs. So my views are more at the global level. But what I believe is that one of the most important issues that both the public and as well as the private energy sectors need to recognize is that in the long term, it pays to invest in climate change, and it pays to invest in biodiversity measures, because this is how to ensure the sustainability of the energy industry. So it is clear that more and more organizations, governments, and decision makers are realizing that energy systems and solutions need to be designed or modified to incorporate all the considerations related to climate change mitigation and adaptation, if they are to be effective, resilient, and sustainable over time. Nevertheless, much more awareness is necessary so that decision makers understand that biodiversity biodiversity is also a good business, and that in the long term is critical to the survival of the business itself, the people, and the planet. So the way I say it is like there are some asymmetries in relation to the issues, the different issues. There is the energy, climate change, and biodiversity. Energy is, in general, as an industry, is perceived as a very important industry, indispensable. It's an indispensable factor in our daily life that has great value. Climate change was ignored for a long time, but in the last decades or so, it's been receiving a lot of scientific as well as political attention. So, and this is because the impacts of climate change are now becoming more evident. Biodiversity, on the other hand, is still not receiving the attention that it deserves. And even though it plays a critical role in many factors and in different aspects, included in relation to energy systems. So public and private sectors need to, in my opinion, to commit more resources into biodiversity activities. In particular, it's necessary to develop models that need to that can quantify the value of ecological services. And there is a need also of more comprehensive set of data, statistics, and indicators that need to be available to demonstrate what the situation is with biodiversity, what the trends are, and what the value of biodiversity is. So the energy sector needs to move towards, I would say, a more holistic approach in which green infrastructure, nature-based solutions, biodiversity conservation, and climate action are directly linked to all the different processes of energy, the extraction of energy resources, construction and operation of energy system, and the management of all the corresponding waste streams, solid waste, liquid waste, and all kinds of emissions to the atmospheres. So actions, I guess actions are needed. I mean, and they're needed now at all levels, at the global, regional, national, local levels, and from the private and the public sector, and creating awareness, because a lot of people don't understand. The people don't understand the value of biodiversity. So you have to create awareness, disseminate the knowledge about the benefits that can be derived from biodiversity in the energy system, and there are also systemic issues that are very important. For example, we're talking about policy and institutional coherence, as well as data monitoring and accountability that need to be tackled in an urgent manner. And finally, I think we need some kind of innovative financial models and technology transfer and capacity building, especially in developed countries. These are critical issues that need to be tackled immediately. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Ivan, and thank you for really, I think, reinforcing that the point around this sort of holistic approach and how that can be mutually reinforcing to both a climate agenda, how nature-based solutions can be used to help sort of be reinforcing for both that climate and that nature agenda. Stephen, oh, have we got our sound back?
Yeah, somebody's pressed the button on the other side of the screen. I can be vocal now. You know, the question is really a key one. It really sits at many, you know, the increasing number of crossroads and cross-cutting dimensions that we have to take. And you know, Emilio was saying about taking this holistic approach. So I'm not going to really echo this because I totally agree. But before I answer the question in detail, just a few words about IPICA. So I've got an IPICA hat, but my day job is working for Total Energies as their group biodiversity specialist. That makes me one of the vice chairs of the Biodiversity and Ecosystem Service Working Group within IPICA. And IPICA is a global oil and gas industry association which focuses on advancing environmental and social performance for its members. it was formed back in 1974, actually at the request of the UN EP, to act as a primary channel of communication between the UN and the oil and gas industry, and this has remained our role today. So we have a vision which is to advance, the industry's environmental social performance and to contribute towards the energy transition. This is an add-on now, to contribute to this energy transition in the context of sustainable development at large. So we cover what we call both the upstream and downstream segments. So this is exploration, production, but also transforming the raw materials into fuel, for example. That's the downstream. We've been working for 45 years, on sustainable development aspects. And just to give you an idea, we're present through our membership across over 180 countries. We represent about 1.1 million people working in the industry, and the membership really covers over 1,800 network representatives within the industry. So it's quite a massive association. And we've, over the years, increasingly structured our approach according to the UN SDG, and wanting to mainstream that within the fact that energy remains a key item that that underpins human well-being and development. And so, the SDGs can help structure also the way we deliver this affordable and reliable energy, which has to remain also accessible in terms of costs, but also, take care of its environmental and social performance and footprints. And of course, we recognize this need for transitioning towards this low emissions future that we require. And this is the climate change crisis as such. And so IPCA's members can, recognize their crucial role in supporting this energy transition and towards making contributions linked to sustainable development at large. Like I said, we have 43 oil and gas companies, and we also include a number of associations, a fairly large number, 29, so the outreach is quite substantial. So if we come back to your question, really my answer is a two-piece answer. I think, this change really starts when there's a recognition of the climate crisis and biodiversity crisis. I think our members are, up to speed with that, and we listen to the IPPC reports and the IPBES reports. In fact, some of our members are part of the IPBES expert group. We contribute to that as for example, I'm an ecologist by training, and I sit in one of the assessment teams. So we're very, very involved. And so this recognition of the climate and biodiversity crisis is the first piece. And, a recognition that they're interlinked and equally important. And I think in terms of timing, I'd echo what Emilio said. I frankly think that the biodiversity crisis is a more immediate crisis. We have less time to handle it. The climate one will span out a bit longer, not much longer, and needs to certainly be addressed, of course. And ideally, we should recognize those interconnections. And, a great example of which illustrates this interconnection is the fact that it's key to protect biodiversity, to keep ecosystem functionalities in place, which in turn allow preserving natural carbon stocks like forests, as well as sink processes, the fluxes, to contribute to staying with this 1.5 degree climate goal that we've embarked on, which was reflected through the Paris Agreement. So that's the first piece of the answer. And the second really is about action. And in terms of changing, the energy sector really should be embarking on the nature positive targets that we're starting to see through the post-2020 GBF and the bending the curve, and match that with the climate net zero ambition pathways. So the two have to go together, and we have to articulate the climate and biodiversity agendas. And so we then are able to, within our industry association, to accommodate for that through our actions. And I'll have an opportunity, I believe, to talk more about what our climate and biodiversity work groups actually do. So embarking on those trajectories, the net positive for nature, nature positive one for biodiversity and the climate net zero ambitions is really paramount. And the energy sector has obviously an important role to play in this change. And this change is actually already occurring with several of our energy sector company members. I certainly see it within our company and a number of other leading companies involved both very, very actively in the climate and nature realms. So this then allows sectoral associations like IPICA to play a key role as a catalyst for this change to further it, because members are not necessarily all at the same level of performance in terms of uptake of what I've just said. And so that's what an association does. It helps raise the bar through capacity building, training, awareness raising, etc. And so one aspect is developing climate and biodiversity good practices, which is really essential for us, and making sure those stay aligned within the UN SDG as a framework is really key also in terms of how we map our actions. And really there also, we're very active in terms of increasing the engagement throughout the sector to support this energy transition and this ecological transition. And so we'll be able to address that, I think, in a little bit more detail in the rest of this discussion.
Thank you, Stephen. And I think, that was really the point, I think, about sort of nature positive as well as net zero and bringing those together. And I think really highlighting that sort of need to move away from just sort of how we sort of reduce and manage impacts to a point that we're actually providing those gains back to nature and reinforcing those climate mitigation outcomes of what nature can deliver as well. So I think that was a really interesting point to make. Fantastic. Well, thank you all of you for providing those kind of opening remarks about that, the climate and the nature nexus, which is that we're trying to sort of grapple with at the moment. And I think that point about biodiversity sort of raising up, and what Stephen said, actually, it's actually more urgent, and we really need to get this right, and we need to be addressing nature as part of how we're doing things immediately, and we need action. If I could actually first follow back with you, Stephen, from the perspective of IPICA, while you have the floor there. Given that you mentioned that many of the members are, oil and gas companies, and its historic role around oil and gas, yet making that contribution to the energy transition, I wonder if you could just explain a little bit more about the ways that IPICA is sort of helping its members to sort of address these crises, and in particular relation to the energy transition.
Sure. I mentioned, Sharon, that we have a number of work streams or work groups. We have a climate work group, and they're super active in terms of awareness raising and capacity building. They, for example, help members define, harmonized greenhouse gas reporting approaches, and this is really important so that we have, a more streamlined voice in terms of how we provide feedback in terms of performance. They conduct work around adaptation and resilience because climate change has been with us for 100 years already. Its manifestations will just increase, and we're starting to see this, in our lifetimes. It's now that it's happening. So adaptation is also an important part of that journey. And so we've developed tools, for example, for physical climate risk evaluation, which includes both economical, because that's the reality check in the world we live in. We have to take care of that to make sure that the livelihoods of people are addressed, and the economics of all the activities are important, but also the environmental, of course. So the adaptation and resilience actions are being conducted within this work group. They're also working a lot around, advancing carbon capture and storage. So there's more evident link there with nature-based solutions or natural carbon sinks. And this is all about emerging focus on CDR, negative emission technologies such as bioenergy. You're hearing an acronym BECCS fly around, and that's exactly what it is. It's capturing carbon through nature, really. And so more recently, IPICA started to update and develop and update its a net zero register of member company pledges towards the net zero ambitions that are already out there, and try and map these. So they were able to understand better what member net zero aspirations look like. And right now we have about 50% of our membership. So I'm focusing here on the 28 on the actual company members as such, and there's 28 that have taken such ambitions, so around net zero concerning greenhouse gas. most of those really target 250 as an outlook and outcome as such, and but there's a number that are pushing their agenda forward and bringing that around, a closer date to us, so more around 230. And this concerns the different scopes, scope 1, 2, and 3 in some cases. But that's, maybe you would say, well, 50% is good, but it's not enough. And so what's important is to see we're not in a linear dynamic here. So since 2020, when we had 2 member companies that were in this kind of net zero philosophy and vision, we've moved to 28 in just less than 12 months. So things are really picking up, and we do an increasing amount of work around renewable electricity generation, alternative energy as we call it. As part of our jargon is evolving progressively. And here, some facts is that we have 6 companies that aim to have about 200 gigawatt installed by 2030. So that's substantial, just really to give you an idea. That's more or less 20 times the current UK offshore wind capacity. So it is significant. And we've worked a lot with the climate team to determine the applicability to the renewable energy sector of our biodiversity guidance developed for oil and gas specifically. And we've seen, that there's a lot of synergies there. And in fact, a lot of the activities are generic enough so that they can allow the renewable energy sector to benefit as such. And of course, there's all the interlinkages between, the climate team's efforts as well as the biodiversity work group. And, that's a lot of work around the natural carbon sinks. I think also maybe I could give you an overview of what the biodiversity work group does. There's recognition that climate change is the third driver of global biodiversity loss. We recognize the IPBES report findings, and biodiversity actually offers a lot of opportunities, like I said, around natural carbon sinks and nature-based solutions. Carbon offsetting are really important, and they tend to go hand in hand with biodiversity offsetting too, and they help reduce emissions and meet targets. And we have a number of examples within our industry association where we have a number of companies that have developed dedicated NBS or natural carbon sink business units. So they're operationalizing this at the business level. And of course, there's quite a few zero net deforestation pledges that are there, or pledges that you could associate to that as such. So that's the interlinkage between the climate and biodiversity work group. But the biodiversity work group itself is very, very active. We have 5 key areas, and I'll just close up here, be real short. And those 5 key areas that keep us busy is around significant level of engagement and partnership development with you guys, for example. But we've developed a collaboration with IUCN recently. We've been working for a long time with UNEP WCMC. We work in a cross-cutting manner with the finance sector and mining sector through the CSBI, the Cross-Sector Biodiversity Initiative. And we're also involved through our members with leading initiatives like SBTN or TNFD, and we also heavily involved in international standards and norms like those developed through the IFC, where we provide feedback through engagement. So just an example of engagement and partnership there, but we work a lot also around developing guidance and tools specifically for biodiversity fundamentals management, biodiversity action planning, net positive impact. We have dedicated capacity building training courses where we work peer-to-peer. We develop with you also a number of awareness briefings and technical work streams that address various topics and use webinars to communicate. Conducting a little bit of benchmarking across members to assess practices. And also, like I previously said, we benefit from member expertise contributions because we have people involved through IPBES or TNFD, for example.
Great, Stephen. An awful lot going on.
Yeah, just pretty busy.
I think it's it's very useful to kind of understand in terms of the role of an association in trying to sort of drive the development of these standardized tools and guidance and materials that can be used. And I thought it was particularly interesting in how the sort of biodiversity management of oil and gas is being applied within the renewables sector, because I think that this is also quite key. So Emilio, I wonder if I could now come to you from the perspective of a company itself and the challenges, to understand a bit more about the challenges that you've faced as a company in dealing with the impacts of renewables, and how you've overcome these, and whether you've, I suppose, come across and used these kind of tools and guidance that are out there that are trying to now be tailored more for use within the renewable sector. Thank you.
Well, indeed, the challenges are huge, and we have a lot of challenges, I have to say. The energy sector is facing such a huge revolution. The demand of energy is growing so rapidly, not only in developing countries, but also in developed countries, where the new services that we want to provide to the society, the aim in the electrification of the economy, are putting a lot of pressure in the way and the pace of the energy development. So that all is bringing a lot of challenges together with the new means for generating energy, where we want to put all our efforts on renewable energy and energy storage and more intelligent services, more efficient energy provision of services for customers. So when we are trying to develop these new generation facilities, either solar plants or wind farms, either onshore and offshore, we are facing a number of pressures that we are putting on the society and nature. So the way we are challenging or trying to overcome these challenges and these impacts is through a strong aim for R&D, collaboration with our supply chain, to try to understand what are the best technologies that are available, how we can develop new technologies, but also with a strong collaboration with the other stakeholders, like the societies, the villages, or the areas where we want to interact. We need to engage with them, understand what their uses are for nature in their areas, how we can keep them available or improve them if possible, and bring all of that together into this exercise of identifying how we are going to develop what we are being asked to develop, which is a lot, and with growing demands. So we are working heavily, for example, to overcome our impacts on birds for our wind farms. We are doing a lot of activity on how to detect the presence of species in the area of our wind farms. We are using cameras, we are using artificial intelligence, we are using we are painting blades, we are putting ice on the tower. We are trying almost everything to try to see how we can mitigate the impacts on the birds around our wind farms. Same happens with solar plants, where the land use is more intense than in wind farms. And that's when, for example, the interaction with the stakeholders come and pay the price, because there are a number of things we can do together with our solar plants to interact and foster not only energy generation, but also activity, economic activity for the rural areas, and also for biodiversity. The studies we are doing are showing that solar plants are an opportunity for biodiversity protection and fostering Okay, so there are a lot of things we can do. There is no such thing as an interaction that has no impact, but we need to work intelligently. We need to understand how our impacts are, what we are doing, how to reduce, apply extensively and massively and thoroughly the mitigation hierarchy, and also apply the conservation hierarchy as well. So we need to mitigate as much as possible, but then we need to compensate. We need to quantify what we are doing and overcome all those negative impacts and provide positive impacts. So challenges are huge. The demand for activity is ever growing. It's incredible what we need to do, and I say not only in developing countries where the challenge is probably stronger, but also in developed countries where we need to end our transition to greener energy mix, renewable generation with energy storage, with smart networks that can deliver the energy in a smarter way, more efficient way, integrate the centralized energy generation with the decentralized energy generation, and then enable all these energy services and advanced services that are appearing and that are also pending to see the light. But it's a lot of work, a lot of interaction, dialogue, R&D, and also good standards of environmental protection with sound methodologies to quantify what we are doing, not only the negative impacts, but also the positive impacts, understand where are the, solutions are, one size fits all doesn't work, so we need to understand what happens in each side, what are the best actions we can take. That requires sound methodologies for evaluation and quantifying and monitoring, etc., etc. So that's what we are doing, working hard and taking high regards for nature. That's what we are doing.
Thank you, Emilio. I think that really illustrated, I think, the integrated approach that we need, and that I think it is an important point to sort of point out that nothing is without impacts, and we need to manage impacts as best we can, but focusing also on those opportunities for both from a kind of provision of nature, enhancing nature and nature services, but also the local developments and and ensuring to continue to supply low and affordable energy. So I wonder, Ivan, on that note, in terms of this sort of integrated approach of how we can deliver those benefits across nature, across climate, across local development and livelihoods, if you could talk to us a little bit more, in particular in relation to the Sustainable Water and Energy Solutions Network and the ways that sort of supports these integrated, I suppose, challenges that we have.
Okay, thank you, Sharon. Yeah, okay. Perhaps I need to say more, explain more about the Global Sustainable Water and Energy Solutions Network. This is a network that was created in 2018 by UNDESA, the United Nations Department of Economic and Social Affairs, as well as Itaipu Binacional, the hydropower plant that operates between Paraguay and Brazil. And it's indeed a global multi-stakeholder. We have partners that are from the public, the private sector, practitioners, etc. And the idea is we're aiming towards having a world where there is more equitable and sustainable use and management of water and energy resources for everyone. And this is, of course, in support of human prosperity, ecosystem integrity, strong economy, and climate change objectives. It's all designed under the umbrella of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. And the main goal of the network is to provide a global platform to enhance capacities and to signal high-level commitments to an integrated completely integrated approach to SDG 6 on water and SDG 7 on energy. And this is because we have understood that these two factors are fully interdependent, and the interlinkages are very strong. So the network promotes this integrated approach also because we realize there are very valuable synergies that can be realized when the factors are taken into consideration together, and to avoid negative trade-offs when the two factors are considered independently. So the network has the vision, especially to try to have a coordinated international cooperation that recognize the strong interlinkages between water and energy. We have over 20 members, and in addition to Itaipu, we have the UNFCCC, the Secretariat of the Convention on Biological Diversity, are also members of the network. So we have, UN agencies, practitioners, etc. In terms of activities, well, the network, the main activities are related to sharing best practices, experiences, and data on water energy interlinkages, to try to build capacities with a focus on creating awareness and exchanging knowledge on innovative systems and on implementing relevant policies, trying to we also have governments as members to try to motivate organizations to implement policies that in which water and energy are considered fully integrated. And we also try to mobilize and scale up multi-stakeholder actions that are mainly aimed at promoting sustainable water and energy solutions. And finally, we work on enhancing advocacy, communication, and outreach to help countries conduct dialogues to facilitate the implementation of SDG 6 and SDG 7. So it's mainly about water and energy, but we also have a knowledge platform in which we in addition to data and statistics, we tackle a number of major issues relevant to water and energy. One of them is, for example, modeling and analytical tools, which is quite important, and also technological areas and innovative systems and international cooperation. But one thing that I have to say is that some of our members already are following a very holistic approach to energy. For example, Itaipu is one of the examples. This is I don't know if everybody's familiar with that, but it's one of the highest hydropower plants in the world, and they are following a very holistic approach in which biodiversity, terrestrial ecosystems, water, and climate change are taken into consideration in this holistic approach. We also have well, other examples, but one in particular that occurs to me right now is an organization, a private organization in Guatemala, the Guatemala Sugar Agro Industry, which is using sugar cane bagasse as biofuel to generate electricity to cover a major share of the electricity consumption in that country, in Guatemala, but and at the same time to cover its internal demand of electricity. But they're following the same holistic approach. They realize it's quite important to take into consideration biodiversity, terrestrial ecosystems, nature-based solutions, climate change, and in general, they're following a sustainable development approach. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you, Ivan. That sounds a fascinating opportunity, I think, to work with members to bring those things together. Actually, we're having a number of questions that are coming in, so I'm just going to start with some interesting observations from our audience. One of the questions, and I think many of you have sort of touched on when we're talking about climate and nature and the role of people in all of this, it's central to everything. And there's a question really around the role of Indigenous peoples that's come through in highlighting that the Indigenous peoples being our main defence to delay the climate and biodiversity crisis. That people play an important role in preserving more than 80% of the world's remaining biodiversity. So do the panel members think that when we talk about biodiversity and the approach, that the role of Indigenous people should always be mentioned, and how you see that role in sort of helping progress the agenda for nature and climate? Do I have any volunteers that want to comment on that? Stephen, please.
Just a brief comment, Sharon. I think that's a really important one too, and certainly the IUCN World Conservation Congress highlighted the necessity to have better representation of IP. Within the Commission work, and there's a dedicated motion for that. So, and a bit of a breakthrough in terms of where we used to be and where we're going to be because of these motions concerning IP considerations. So that's clearly, I mean, the writing's on the wall that more of that needs to happen. There's a number of reports also that have demonstrated that some of the best protected areas are managed because of IP involvement. So it all kind of makes sense, and because people know the land, because they have the very strong dependency from a natural capital kind of perspective or ecosystem service. So it just makes sense, and it's also picked up in IFC performance standards. There's a dedicated standard on IP and vulnerable communities. So and I cite those because those are the benchmark, for best practice or good practice for project and operational development. So, clearly, yes, the answer is that there's more that needs to happen, and that they play a paramount role in nature protection, and therefore maintaining forests in place when they're supported by national governments instead of obstructed. So they keep the stock in place. That's what we were saying previously. The forests need to stand up and to play that role as natural carbon sinks, but healthy ecosystems at large. And it's not just forests. It's so people having a strong dependency and link with the land and the biodiversity in it are vectors of preserving the health of those. They can be the custodians in many respects. That's just my 5 cents on that.
Thank you so much, Stephen. Yes, I totally agree. No, it's good to see that recognition that's there. Okay, so I'm going to turn to a different question on quite a different topic in a way. So moving away, so I think we've sort of covered quite a lot around the sort of integrated element of what we're trying to do across nature, people, and climate. There's some specific questions coming in, I think, around how we manage impacts of renewables. There's one question, for example, around what as we're upscaling the renewable sector, and notably offshore wind, and the impacts that we know quite well around bird and marine mammals, the impacts that they can have. Welcome views from the panelists on what governments and businesses actually can do to address the problems that we could be having more of as we upscale that renewables sector with the types of impacts that they could potentially have. I don't know, Amelia, if you would come in from the perspective of a business that's trying to manage impacts, and how perhaps your company has been dealing with those.
That's certainly a critical topic, and I think I referred to it in my previous intervention. We really need to change the way we do things. I mean, we need to, and that's what I started my intervention at the beginning. We need to consider biodiversity as a key element, as a key stakeholder, if I can say, as part of our activity. There is a lot to do to understand and to be able to mitigate what we are, the negative impacts of what we are doing. It's a difficult question to answer, what the actual impacts are, because there are a number of synergies that are happening in nature. It's open system. So we come with an infrastructure here and we do our bit, but then there are other things around. So it's a difficult matter to tackle. But I will stick to what I said earlier. We need to work really hard and study a lot, study what's going on, long-term studies that will tell us what's going on. And you need to look at nature in a holistic approach. As I said, it's not just one thing that is intervening in how nature is reacting or responding or developing in a given area. So a lot of work with the research institutions is needed, universities, to understand, to increase the knowledge of how things work, how we can do things better. Of course, we all need to set ambitious goals that we can adhere to and try to meet. The most obvious one would be, of course, to become positive on biodiversity. And understanding what that means is also another question. But that is the goal that we all need to adhere to. I mean, and many companies are coming to that. So are we. It's just a matter of hard work, understanding, reducing impacts, and also working with local communities, with local research institutions that will understand how nature works on a given area where you are putting an infrastructure or an activity. But it's a must that we all need to take the internal goal of neutralizing or even improving the way nature works where we are operating. That's the way to go, and it's going to be it's not going to be an easy path. We cannot calculate the equivalent eagle for our activities as we do in climate change with CO2 equivalents. That's easy one. Nature is much more complex, so there's a lot of work there. There are many projects and research is being developed around the world on how to do this. A number of different methodologies, and different methodologies will have different applications, and we all need to learn and understand how to use them. What are the benefits of one or the other, and just work from there.
Yeah, thank you. It's right. I mean, it's incredibly complex, and I think you're right that there's an awful lot of sort of research on the way to try to understand and the nature of those impacts. I guess one of the questions that's also come through is regarding how we measure performance. So, given the fact that we're talking about having ambitious goals and talking about being nature positive, talking about sort of addressing those impacts, I wonder if anyone could comment on the sort of approaches that can be taken of how do we measure performance of the energy sector regarding biodiversity. You've commented it's not as straightforward as it is for climates. There are many elements, and particularly when we're talking about biodiversity as well as the ecosystem services that people depend on, there are many elements to what we're trying to achieve through biodiversity management. Would anybody hazard a guess how best to? Ivan, I think you put your hands up first. Do you want to come in and how we can measure performance of the energy sector?
Yeah. Yeah, I found that question quite interesting. I think performance is a very important and very difficult issue. But one of the tools that need to be developed is modeling systems, innovative modeling systems that allow us to value the ecological services. They allow us to value what biodiversity and paying attention to nature-based solutions and terrestrial ecosystem as well as water ecosystems. It's it's a very difficult issue and very difficult to measure when you have a complex an energy system that is complex. Let's say a huge power plant or a park of wind towers or any other system, thermoelectric plants. Then there are so many parts that are affected, and there are benefits and there are negative impacts. But sometimes the way the performance is measured is not it's not taking into consideration all the goods and the bads. And for certain energy systems, you need to look at the long term, because the performance, even though this is one of the things that people don't realize, that there are there is a need for knowledge dissemination and awareness, is that even for business in the long term, it pays to take into consideration biodiversity. It pays into consideration to take solutions and natural solutions and to take care of all the systems around, because if not, the efficiency of the power plant, for example, it starts to go down. The capacity, the ability to produce in an effective and efficient manner is diminished. And many times people don't understand that. It's only in the short term, looking at the short term and the direct profits versus cost. But if you take care of these things, it's smarter. It's smarter to take care of these things. It's valuable. At the end, you benefit, and your company benefits. Your business will benefit. Thanks.
Yeah, Ivan. I think the sort of taking that long-term approach and the role of sort of actually valuing is an important one. I wonder, Emilio, do you want to come in from the perspective, I suppose, of a business in terms of the sort of measurement?
Just two things, just to continue on what Ivan just said. I think my company is a good example of how betting on sustainability pays off. If you look at our trajectory from early 2000 until today, you can see that. But I wanted to tell you about what we are doing in terms of Iberdrola to try to understand impacts. And as Ivan was saying, we are really concerned on balance. We are all used to measuring negative impacts. That's very easy. They are easy to see and maybe quite easy to understand and to quantify. The positive impacts are much tougher. But we all need to come up with this methodology that enables us to measure the balance in whether you are negative or in positive or you are leveled. We are trialing a number of methodologies internally in Iberdrola with our technologies, either hydro, wind, solar, and thermal, and networks technology. We are testing several of them to understand what each one of them can provide, what information we can extract from them, and how we can apply them to each technology. The idea that we have is to build a accountability from bottom up from all of our assets, and we are targeting like 2 dimensions of impacts. One related to ecosystems in general that are related to land use change and impacts on land that will affect ecosystem. And other methodologies will tackle species affections, how we interact with protected or endangered species, and how we can counteract whatever marginal impact that we are still producing. And we expect to have some results sometime next year, so we can define how Iberdrola will start assessing a baseline of impacts and start to develop action plans to overcome those and change the way we do things. I mean, all businesses by nature will look for the smartest way to do things. So that means that we are already doing a lot of things to reduce our impacts, to make things more efficient, and it is the case most of the times that avoiding an impact is cheaper and more effective than trying to compensate it. So it's by nature moving towards that approach to impacts. But we need to make the final nudge to have everything aligned to a given goal with the proper KPIs, with proper metrics that tell us whether we are doing things right or we need to shift a bit here or there. So that's what we are doing just now. I mean, trying to understand how to measure. There's nothing. I mean, that's the starting point to try to change things.
No, that's really interesting to hear. Yeah, and it's always going to. I think it's always a challenging thing to have the right KPIs to tell us what we need to know. A couple of questions that have come in are sort of reflected also on the fact that the outcomes, I suppose, of energy projects is largely also down to how these projects are planned in the landscapes, and that it's not just the role of businesses, but also the sort of planning agencies and governments and countries that play a role here in the likely outcome of what these projects will deliver. And there's a particular question around, I've just lost it. Oh yeah, there we go. Regional strategic assessments, so strategic environmental assessments and planning the expansion of new energies. And I, as I alluded to in the beginning, I suppose there's always that element of the severity of impacts on biodiversity is largely down to the location in which they happen, and so the planning being a really important element of that. So I don't know if anybody wants to comment. The specific question is really whose responsibility is it to carry out strategic environmental assessments and be involved in that kind of decisions around where infrastructure is located and so on. Would anybody like to comment on the sort of planning and the role of government versus business?
I can have a quick stab. Sharon, clearly it sits within the government's, within the national authorities' responsibility. We can be, as businesses, contributors when we're invited to be a contributors. I mean, and I guess we should be expecting that, because we're expected to conduct pretty significant stakeholder engagement when we design projects and throughout the lifetime of operations. It doesn't stop when the production starts. So we should be expecting the same both ways. It's a two-way dialogue, and then that creates opportunities for better representation of those activities of an existing operation within the landscape. It helps to address cumulative impacts in particular. That's really key, whether it's onshore or offshore. So it's, I think, in everyone's interest for industry and in the energy sector, as others, frankly, to be part of those stakeholders that should be brought to the table when we conduct the consultation. It doesn't always happen, though, unfortunately. So because of historical, cultural approaches, I think from regulators that maybe feel their role is definitive, but it's a shame because it's a missed opportunity. In fact, that was one of the discussions back in just up ahead of the COP14 in Sharm el-Sheikh about bringing all the stakeholders around the table. This was concerning NBSAPs, the National Biodiversity Action Plans, and then allowing the industry that's out there to play an active role in that mosaic of activities and stakeholders. And I think for renewable energy in particular, it'd be very important because, well, it's certainly been the case for oil and gas, because oil is in a given location, let's say the Gulf of Mexico, the North Sea. That needs to happen at a strategic seascape level. The same happens in landscape operations, and certainly, it would apply to renewables too.
So I think that's that good answer around. Clearly, it's sort of the mandate, I suppose, of the government to lead these assessments, but it's that sort of stakeholder buy-in that's hugely important. I wonder actually if we could. So we've talked quite a lot now about, I think, the sort of site-based impacts of different energy sectors and how these can be managed individually by companies as well as more broadly. But one of the other issues, of course, that we have rising up the agenda as we scale up renewables are the supply chain impacts. So as we, expect to see much more demand for these kind of minerals, so I'd like to explore a little bit more around where the industry, I suppose, thinking is around how to manage the supply chain risks associated with these developments. I don't know, Emilio, if you would like to comment from the perspective of your business of how you have tackled the demand for minerals and any challenges that you're seeing in terms of the impacts that could be associated with that.
Managing supply chain is another big issue. The way we are not directly engaged with raw material extraction. It will be our supplier that will do that on a secondary. We buy things already built. We haven't seen. The way. Raw materials, steel and iron and rare earths and things like that. I consider them more to be on the circular economy side rather than on the biodiversity side. Of course, these extractions need to be made as well in consideration with biodiversity. Circularity is another of the key topics that I consider to be the three pillars for nature conservation, one being climate change, the other one being biodiversity support, and the third one being natural capital or circularity or things like that. So it is really a key matter. What we can do from a big corporation like us, we of course set clear and ambitious objectives and clear and thorough policies that will drive all our activities. And those ambitions, those policies will drive downstream to our supply, well, that would be upstream in this case, to our supply chain and influence them to change. Of course, probably the biggest challenge will be in the smaller companies that probably have a tougher case in doing things better. They will have the case if we demand them, of course, but there are things that they will take their time. Equivalent companies, the big companies like us, we will all set our agendas, hopefully, in line with the global goals. We will be very much influenced by our stakeholders, investors, and institutions and things like that. So we will all do our bit sooner or later. And we have the duty of influencing and pulling from our supply chain to bring them to a higher standard, either by just refusing to procure goods that are not meeting our standards, or maybe providing resources like training, like awareness, like working with them gradually to bring them to a higher standard operation.
Great, thank you. So yeah, that supply chain engagement element of being able to drive increased performance of suppliers as well being quite key. Stephen, is this something that's on IPCA's radar at the moment in terms of the move into renewables?
Yeah, historically it's been a focus, on the global impacts from the climate change aspects, and that's the climate work groups worked on that. For biodiversity, it has been focused largely on the local biodiversity impacts. So, that's that's just the history and the maturity developing. But we have a supply chain work group that's been developing tools which help assess risk across the supply chain. So you have categories of activities that have categories of needs in terms of raw materials or services and products. So we have a tool that allows to assess this risk across the value chain. It's not linked to like first or second order suppliers. It's rather what is material or not material. And that then allows you to identify, where those issues are. I mean, the obvious ones are like all the strategic materials, which include metals, but the number of companies, biofuels is really important, the feedstock, if you're involved in refining, and certainly I speak for my company, but you mentioned the sugarcane, that's a huge land grab, and that's a huge water footprint potentially. So if not a social one, and then, I would want to avoid what Emilio just said, that's spot on. So we have to reach out and have that influence, provide them with some tools to better manage their own risks and the capacity building and training. Sometimes we have some nice surprises too. I mean, they're quite advanced in terms of how they're managing things, because if it's an extractive industry, if you're talking to a large mining company, they're out there and they're exposed. So usually things run, are well managed, and that reduces our risk. But I could certainly say, for Total Energies, we've got a no-go in UNESCO World Heritage Sites for operations, for exploration production, which we've applied to our suppliers. So suppliers that are conducting extraction or production activities of natural resources in UNESCO World Heritage Sites are no longer our suppliers. So that you can filter. I mean, you've got huge power to leverage, and just like, you go to the supermarket, you vote in terms of what you buy and don't buy. Well, the same applies to industry. They can decide, who will provide the steel, who for the pipelines, or the copper for the electrification, and so on and so forth. So it's something that maybe a lot of energy and extractive companies have looked a little bit less at, simply because they have, a lot of them, an integrated supply chain. They're their own suppliers, you see? So so that we're working a little bit in a silo, and big oil is to a large extent like that. But with the renewables, things are changing. It's not just wind and solar, it's the biogas, the biofuels. And so it brings a whole suite of new challenges that need to be looked at. And there's the overall maturity I was referring to in terms of how to deal with this. But there's a large number. I mean, the agro industry is hugely, practiced to deal with such topics. And so there's the apparels, fashion industry. Their footprint is not their direct operations. It's the supply chain. So that's I'd say fairly well under control, or it can be if you want to put the energy into it.
Yeah, I think it's a very interesting observation of the difference between the conventional sector and the renewables in terms of supply chain visibility. And that actually kind of leads on to some other questions that have come in. A couple more questions that have come in around. We were talking about how you measure performance, how you choose the right KPIs, and so on. And there's questions around, do the existing reporting frameworks, are they relevant? Are they fit for purpose? And I suppose for the renewable sector, and maybe in light of the discussion that we're having around the need to incorporate those supply chain impacts and maybe impacts related to your suppliers, are they things that are reported on? Are these things is this still something that needs to be further developed within the reporting frameworks, and how impacts are essentially being measured and reported on? So if anybody wants to comment on reporting frameworks in general, or specifically in relation to supply chain.
Well, everything needs to be improved. Everything in life can be improved. I think reporting schemes have experienced a strong development over the last few years because of all these stakeholder engagement, these financial institutions, the governments. The pressure on reporting is orders of magnitude higher now than what it was a few years ago. And the way we are reporting our performance has developed accordingly. There are elements that are part of the reporting that are well defined, and I think they provide good information on how companies perform in a given matter. Supply chain is a real challenge because you are dealing with third-party information that could be shared among different customers, and I mean there are a lot of issues that we need to tackle. First of all, data quality, understanding what the suppliers are reporting, avoiding double counting. It's a real issue, and I know there are things under development to provide centralized systems where suppliers would upload their information and customers from these suppliers would extract their own bid and things like that. It's a really complex matter. We are all trying. We have a duty to report on supply chain, and we are trying to develop our own systems, centralized systems, and that where our suppliers will provide information that we can collate and add up and report as much as possible. But I think still a lot of work to be done on that matter. We are doing as much as we can, but I mean the pressure is high because we have to report on a number of new things every year. And together with that, we are pushing our supply chain to give us also information. It's a real it's a turbulent matter reporting. Some elements are solid, some elements are mature, others are in the development.
Yeah, I can imagine. There is also a question on if businesses do not find or are unable to develop the right KPIs, would this justify inaction? And I think this is an interesting question around the role of reporting, which is sort of being able to demonstrate progress and coupled with the sort of overall strategy and understanding by business of that more long-term view and where you're trying to go and what you're trying to achieve regarding climate and nature. So if anybody would like to comment on the role of KPIs in driving action.
Yeah, maybe just a comment also. You know, I think most of the environmental compartments like waste, water, greenhouse gas, all those are quite well under control. The big challenge is the corporate biodiversity footprint, you know, aggregating local impacts. And like Emilio was saying, you know, it's hard to aggregate orangutans, giraffes, crickets, plants, and whales. Water is cubic meter, greenhouse gas equivalent, CO2 ton, much easier. So that's where, and there's a huge forum working on this, number of platforms. Yeah, certainly we've UNWCMC with the through the Proteus Alliance and the biodiversity, the BISI program has really helped move things forward. And we're also confronted to a plethora of different methods, metrics, tools. So, you know, but I have trust, and I'm quite confident that gradually we're narrowing in the right direction. What's important is that it's based on good, solid science. And you know, the SBTN network is really important. The TNFD is going to help you know, pin these things down. It's a collegial effort, and it's got to reach a relative consensus. There'll be winners and losers, of course, but what we don't want is situations where, you know, we have there's a lot of extra financial reporting that is happening. I can hear Emilio's difficulties there with all the questionnaires. Like we're familiar with those, and you know, on all these different themes. So what we want is to spend, you know, time doing reporting on things that really matter. And in fact, when we're not providing an answer, if the question is built on good science and is sound and has been done through intense stakeholder engagement with industry in terms of doing the reality check, then not providing an answer the first year is okay, because that then flags to your management that we should be doing things a bit differently and can release resources, improve capacity, and so on for the following years. So that is okay, but what we don't want is to be forced in a position where we're reporting on something that is not based on good science. Because we still haven't got that 1.5 degree target for climate. We've got that, but not for biodiversity. And so really that we need to, I think as a community, work and contribute towards that as best as we can, so that we because we have limited resources. I mean, there's these big, it's hard to hear from a big oil company, of course, but or large energy companies, but the expertise is not always there, and so we rely on outsource and work with partnerships. And there's some very good people out there doing a fantastic job. It's just that there's a bit of a rush because we are on the other side losing biodiversity very, very, very quickly, and so that's important. But we can see a rise in investor expectations, so I'm quite confident that have the same question in 2 years on biodiversity footprinting, and we should be much closer to where we need to be.
Yeah, I totally agree. There's an enormous amount of activity in that space, and I think that the message has come out through so many meetings. I think at World Conservation Congress was quite strong as well around, the science is coming, but let's not wait. We need action ahead of the science as well. So, and that seems, to be an important point. We are really close to the end of this now, so I actually just want to ask each of you very quickly. I think we have something like 60 seconds each. Just to provide your perspective on what does the future of energy systems look like? What are the main challenges? What are your key messages that you want to give our audience today around what the future of energy looks like? Ivan, would you like to go ahead first?
Sure. Well, the only thing is we have very little time. But first of all, I think it's the first thing to recognize is that there's still great uncertainty. So even though the trends that we are seeing now in relation to the energy system, they may change because we don't know what's going to be the impact of climate change, especially if the 1.5 degrees Celsius reduction in temperature is not reached, and also with the biodiversity losses, as well as the deterioration of terrestrial and water ecosystems. Nevertheless, it's clear that the trend is towards advanced clean energy technologies, and it's an accelerated development and deployment of renewable energies, especially wind and solar, will continue. And also the idea that we're moving from centralized to decentralized electricity grid, it's important. And of course, I think during the energy transition period, I still see a lot of hydropower and nuclear, and also natural gas will continue playing a considerable role, perhaps in the next 1 or 2 decades. In relation to challenges, I think one of the most important challenges is timing. Timing is important because this energy transformation needs to be achieved at a very limited time. But it's important that we move forward to reach the energy, the climate change and other environmental objectives on time, in order to avoid more catastrophic situations all over the world. So I also see a more electrified world, in which we will have electric autonomous cars and more electricity processes on all the sectors of the economy, the manufacturing, not only transport, but manufacturing, agricultural, service, etc. On the technology front, there are some challenges. For example, the idea that we need more advanced batteries, like less expensive, more efficient, safer, and lighter. And we also some of the challenges in the technology side, it could be related to advanced technologies. For example, the development of hydrogen, green hydrogen, and its required infrastructure. In relation to opportunities, well, in short, I think this, the opportunity that we have right now is the opportunity to build back better after this interconnected crisis that we're trying to get rid of. And the idea is not just to accelerate a movement toward clean energy technologies, but also to have a full consideration of the three dimensions of sustainable development: the social, the economic, and the environmental, and to be able to include in the cost of producing and generating electricity, distributing energy, the cost of ecological services, the cost of the protection, restoration of terrestrial and water ecosystems, and reversing biodiversity losses, in addition, of course, to climate change. And the sustainable energy transition also provides an opportunity to generate jobs, to generate a lot of jobs in clean energy technologies. And one example is even for the major challenge of energy access, because there are still a lot of people without electricity, a lot of people using dirty fuels for cooking all over the world. But in that area, the people, the poorest people, it's good to have these mini micro grids that are smart enough in which neighbors could exchange electricity. And this is something that is already happening. And we have 2 members in our network on sustainable water and energy solutions that are currently doing this in Bangladesh. Thank you.
Thank you, Ivan. Thanks, Ivan. We are running over, so if I could just ask Emilio and then Stephen, just in one sentence, if you could complement that very comprehensive vision that we had laid out by Ivan with any final words.
I would like to send a positive message. I mean, I disagree with the view that we are all talking and doing nothing. I think a lot of it is being done. The challenge is massive, but I think the awareness of companies and governments is really high. It will take time and it will be ups and downs, but the direction is clear. It's going to be a more rectified, cleaner, and more sustainable future in the energy sector.
Thank you.
My key word, Sharon, would be inclusivity. We should stick to that 1.5 degree target. If not, we're in trouble, and we are in trouble. But without sacrificing the nature positive one and bending that curve, because we really depend on our livelihoods are underpinned by a healthy biodiversity. So yeah, that'd be my message. And then leave no one behind. That's what I mean by inclusivity.
Fantastic, thank you. Well, apologies to everyone that we have run over, but this has been a really, really energized discussion, I think, highlighting all the challenges of this interconnected crises that we have facing us. We've talked a lot about the interconnectedness, about measurements. I think the upcoming Global Biodiversity Framework and the targets being set by that will be really important in this space to help guide businesses, guide sectors forward, and to be able to get the contributions, I think, from businesses represented within what we need to achieve as society. So I'm not going to deliberate further because I realise we have gone massively over now, I think by 5 minutes. So apologies for keeping you all here, but thank you so much to our speakers today. Thank you, Emilio. Thank you, Stephen. Thank you, Ivan, and thank you, Bianca, for organising us, and to the CBD Secretariat for the opportunity for this event today. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Nice meeting everybody.